My name is Tom Pereira. I grew up in New York City and became a professor of neuroscience, specializing in studying information coding in the human brain. I've been a ham radio operator for over 70 years, and I want to tell you about the early days and the future of ham radio. I'm going to start out with a wonderful little children's book written by Lynn Barash. And this book is interesting because it really follows my own experiences as a ham radio operator. The title of the book is Radio Rescue. And if you look at the first page, you see a picture of Central Park in New York City and a bunch of buildings out around the outside of the park and a statue of Samuel Morse in the park. And I actually grew up in one of those buildings, and right across the street from me was the statue of Samuel Morse. Here's how it looks now. I didn't realize who Samuel Morse was at that point, but he must have had some kind of an influence on my life. I was fascinated by listening to radios because I had a grandmother who had this wonderful, huge Zenith radio in her living room. And I used to turn the dials when nobody was looking. And if it turned things just right, the radio would speak to me. I was pretty young at that point, so I was absolutely convinced that there was a little guy inside the radio, and he would say all sorts of things, and every once in a while he'd put some music on for me to listen to. But being really small, I had no idea how the radio worked. And I always figured that this little guy was living in there. I couldn't understand how he could eat or go to the bathroom inside a radio that size. So I had a lot of fun, and I became quite fascinated by the sounds that I heard. And I eventually became so fascinated that I decided to get a ham radio license. And at that time, you had to learn the Morse code in order to get a ham radio license. And that was really tough. I sat there and I tried to learn, and I tried to learn all those characters. And when I'd walk my dog on the street, I would talk to the dog in Morse code. When I took a bus on the street, I would think in Morse code. And even when I went to school, I would think in Morse code. So I was really trying very hard to learn the Morse code. And finally, I got to the point where I decided to go and take the test to become a ham radio operator. And that meant going downtown in New York City to a really scary big federal building and a really scary person who gave me the test, never smiled at all, and finally said, "You passed, kid." And that was very exciting for me. So I hung my license up on the wall, and I got my daddy, and we went together down to Radio Row in New York City to see what we could buy and see what we could learn about radio. Radio Row was an absolutely wonderful place in those days, absolutely filled with parts and radios and batteries, and it was just absolutely lots of fun for me. So I went down there with my daddy, and we bought a lot of parts to make ourselves a radio transmitter. And we brought them home. My mother wasn't real excited about that, but we started putting together this radio transmitter, mounting meters in the panel, and looking at the schematic diagrams. I learned about the wiring of a radio transmitter at that point. And then came the problem of an antenna. And antennas are not easy to put up in New York City. But what I decided to do was to try and put up what we now call a stealth antenna, something that nobody would notice. And I got to know the superintendent of my building and the superintendent of the building across 72nd Street from me. And they both said, okay. And I went up on the roof of my building and dropped a wire down to my father. And he put it together with a wire that had been dropped down from the other building on the other side of the street. And of course, you always do antenna raisings at night because it looks pretty suspicious and you don't want to be caught. So we got away with it and pulled that antenna tight. And lo and behold, I had a long wire antenna across 72nd Street in New York City, and I could hook it to my transmitter. And at that point, I started making contacts with people in the United States, and then I got really excited and started making contacts with people in foreign countries, in England and France, and finally I was actually able to work into Australia, and that was very exciting for me at that point. Of course, I became involved in radio rescue communications in public service. When there'd be floods in the United States, I would get on the air and help the communications of the floods, and sometimes it involved talking to other radio amateurs who were in the flooded area and carrying message back to their families in New York City, or telephoning people saying they were okay. It was a very exciting time in ham radio. And in the book, it shows a reporter coming and taking pictures of this kid who has been involved in public service communications and rescue operations. That never happened to me, but it's a great little part of the book. And finally, the book ends up with a picture of the ham radio operator that the book was written about, the grandfather of Lynn Barish. And his call letters were W2AZK. And you can see the radio transmitter system that he has, built his own radio transmitter. And the title at the top is not something he was probably very happy about. Infant radio operator, works foreign stations nightly. But anyway, it was similar, very similar to my experiences in ham radio. Radio Row in New York City, as I was growing up, was the best place in the world to buy surplus electronics. It was just filled with radio equipment, radios for sale, parts for sale. And I grew up during World War II, so Radio Row had immense number of military radios and military radio parts for sale. Radio Row was torn down to make room for the World Trade Center. I wrote all sorts of letters to the to the government saying, don't do this, but they did it anyway. Let's take a look at Radio Row in those days. It was an absolute wonder. People would stand out in front of their stores, pile up radios out in front of their stores. When it would rain, they'd take them all in. Look at those radios for sale. And you could even buy secondhand used automobile batteries to power your radio in those days. Here's another guy standing in front of his store and pointing to some of the chassis. You could buy parts for any part of your radio, and you could even buy aluminum chassis to mount the parts on, make your own radios. My favorite radio store in Radio Row was this guy. And he would take in a lot of radio sets, and he'd try to fix them for people, or he'd give them trade-in for selling them a new radio. And at the end of the day, about 4:30 in the afternoon, he would put all the radio sets that he hadn't been able to fix, or that he'd taken in as trade, out on the street at 25 cents a piece. And I just absolutely loved that. I went up to him and I said, look, I'm a really little kid here, and 25 cents is a lot of money to me. Would you give me a couple of those radios? And he said, sure, kid, just get them out of here. So I would go back there every once in a while, about once a week at 4:30, and I would fill my arms and baskets and boxes with whatever radios I could carry back on the subway, and I would take them apart. And I took them all apart, and I had boxes full of condensers and boxes full of resistors. Of course, I didn't know what those were at that point. I had many, many boxes full of screws, 632 screws. I had enough 632 screws to have used them for the rest of my life, thousands of them out of these sets. In any event, the guy finally decided, hey, kid, you know, you're just taking apart these radios. You're not learning anything. Why don't you just sit down and build a radio, and you'll learn something about it by building it, especially if you follow the instructions. So he taught me how to solder, and he told me to go and buy a night kit radio. This is a 1947 night kit radio. And in 1947, I was 9 years old, and I put this thing together really, really carefully. I soldered it just the way he told me. And I called my parents into the room and I said, Mom, Dad, I'm going to turn on the radio. And I turned on the radio, pow, loud noise, and the room went completely dark. And I was not happy about that. And my father said, oh, okay, just unplug the thing and I'll go down, change the fuse, and we'll see what's going on. And he changed the fuse, and there was my radio smoking away and filling up the room with the most awful smell. My mother is screaming, get that thing out of here. It's smelling up the house terribly. I didn't know what to do. This radio was obviously in bad condition. There was nothing I could do. I didn't know how to fix a radio at that point. So finally, I took the radio down to my friend in the store and I said, would you please help me with this? Something went wrong with my radio and I can't fix it. Maybe you could help me fix it. And he said, sure, kid, I'll do that. And he unscrewed the back of the radio and he undid the knobs and unscrewed the chassis, pulled the chassis out. And he started laughing. Oh my God, he started laughing. He laughed so hard he was crying. And I kept saying, well, what's the matter? Can we fix it? And every time I'd say, can we fix it? He'd go into spasms of laughter. Fix it, kid. Yeah, oh no. And so finally, after he laughed himself out pretty much, I said, well, tell me what's the matter? What's the story here? And he said, look at this, kid. And he showed me the tube sockets that I had inside the radio where I had soldered all my components onto the tube sockets. And he said, kid, you soldered every single part to every other part and every pin on the tube to every other pin on the tube. And he laughed and he laughed. And then I said, well, could you help me fix it? And he'd go off into another paroxysm of laughter. I said, no, kid, no, this is not fixable. I'll tell you what I'll do, kid. I'll buy you another kit and I'll show you how to solder again. And you build that kit and we'll make sure it works. But you got to give me this radio. I'll keep it for you. And I think what he actually did was he kept that radio to show all his friends, and he would have them all over for beer, and they'd all sit around and laugh at my soldering job at my expense. Anyway, finally, I built the radio and I still have it. It was the first radio I built, and it actually finally worked, and it still works quite surprisingly after all this time. In any event, that was a big lesson that I learned, and I decided that I would go back down to Radio Row, and I had my license at that point, a little after that, and I went down to Radio Row. I had earned my license and passed the code test, and I decided I would look around for radio to buy. And I went to various radio stores. Every once in a while, these radio stores would have sales, and mobs of people would stand outside, like in Modell's radio store. People would stand around and wait for the sale, the doors to open for the sale. One of the big stores in Radio Row is ARRL Electronics, and they had a magnificent window with all kinds of ham radio sets on the right in here, and lots of test equipment to look at. It was just a wonderful window, and you went inside the store, was just packed full of wonderful stuff, hi-fi equipment upstairs and radio equipment and parts downstairs, and a wonderful display of all kinds of ICO test equipment up on the wall. It was very impressive. And if you went over to their ham radio corner, you could see a bunch of radio sets that they'd taken in on trade, and some of them were new. And I looked at those real carefully. But then I went over to Harrison Radio, and Harrison Radio was just the most incredible ham radio dedicated store. Their prime sales were to ham radio operators, and they took in radios and trade. And this a picture of their showroom. You can see many, many Collins transmitters and receivers on the left, Collins in the middle, and Collins on the right. And those were the radios that Mr. Harrison was most trying to sell because they were the most expensive ones. But as you went back, things got a little bit cheaper. And it was just absolutely a wonderful store to go through. And I went there and I decided, boy, look at all those radios. I'm gonna try and get the best radio. I went to my father and I said, Daddy, I want a radio receiver. My little night kit is just AM and I want to get on the ham radio band. So I got my license. And he said, sure, kid, go ahead and buy one. I went down to Harrison Radio and Mr. Harrison. I said, I want to buy a Collins receiver. And he said, sure, kid, I'll sell you a Collins receiver. Here's a nice 75A2. And I got that receiver home and I started listening to it. It was a beautiful, beautiful receiver. Luckily, my father had a lot of money. I didn't know it at the time, so he didn't mind buying me this thing. Collins radio was pretty expensive in those days. Anyway, I turned it on, I hooked it to my antenna. Oh, bad news, things happened. All I could hear, just completely blanked out all of the radio signals that I was listening to on the radio by radio station WABC. WABC was a broadcast AM station in New York City that was so powerful that it completely blanketed the band on my Collins receiver. So I wrote to Mr. Collins and I said, I just bought one of your Collins receivers and all I can hear is WABC. It's totally desensing the receiver. I can't hear anything on any of the bands. And he said, well, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you our repair van. And sure enough, in those days, if you bought a radio like that, they want to make sure you were happy with it. They sent the Collins Radio Company on-site repair van out to help me fix the radio. And the guy got out and he came upstairs and he looked at the radio, he listened to it, and he said, yep, needs a trap. I had no idea what a trap was at that point, but he got a little aluminum box and he got a coil and a condenser and he put together a trap for me, which was a slug tune coil. And he tuned it and put it in my antenna line. And all of a sudden, WABC just disappeared and I was able to hear signals again. So it was absolutely wonderful. Can you imagine Collins Radio sending out a repairman to fix some kid's receiver? I don't think those kinds of things happen anymore. Anyway, I was happy as could be with my radio listening to stations, and I decided I needed a transmitter. I went down to Harrison Radio. I said, Mr. Harrison, I want to buy a Collins radio transmitter to go with my receiver that you sold me. And he said, sorry, kid, can't sell you a transmitter. You got to build your first transmitter. And that was the best thing that man ever has done for me, and probably the best thing anybody ever did for me in my life, because when I built the radio that you see on the left, the transmitter, which was an ICO 75-watt a transmitter with an 807 final, I learned a lot about radio. And I ended up knowing quite a bit about electronics because I had built that. If I hadn't built that radio, I would have just been a dumb operator and I never would have learned much about electronics. The knowledge of electronics helped me immensely in my career as a professor because I could pick up and record tiny little electrical signals in the nervous system in the brain that all my colleagues were unable to deal with. They didn't know how to do that kind of thing. So it was really a wonderful thing that he did for me. And that transmitter, I put it on the air, I used it for a little while, and finally I decided that I would build a better transmitter. And this is still the same year. I had increased the radio equipment on my desk a little bit with a Gonset communicator, 2-meter radio for talking to hams in the local area on 2 meters AM. And I built that transmitter that you see on the left, which was capable of running 150 watts. And then the next year, I ended up with a lot more equipment, and I built a great big 6-foot high relay rack filled transmitter on the far left there that had a pair of 813 final, and it ran AM at 1,000 watts. You can still see my Collins receiver with a nice little Johnson Viking Ranger on top of it, some other equipment. But the one that you should really notice here is the guy on my desk. That receiver is an absolutely amazing receiver. I had learned how to buy things in the QST classified ads at that point, and I saw this receiver, and the ad said Hallicrafters DD1. And I didn't know what a Hallicrafters DD1 was, so I looked it up, and I found that it was a dual diversity receiver capable of being hooked up to 2 different antennas. It had 2 different front ends, and you could actually pick the antenna and the front end that was bringing in the best signal and listen to it. So it was a quite an extraordinary receiver. I didn't know how rare it was at that point. Here's the DD1 on the cover of the 1939 Radio Shack catalog. I didn't get the loudspeaker system that went with it that it's sitting on, but it was really quite a dramatic receiver. I've never actually seen one since then. There must have made very few of them. Anyway, there were lots of people in those days that built their own ham gear and ham radio stations. This was a friend of mine who had his equipment up in an attic in his house in Long Island. And you can see he had separate transmitters for every band, and he had tuning condensers up above his head. They didn't worry about any possible medical effects of radio frequency radiation in those days. You can see his head was right up next to the tuning condensers, and he had a great station there. And here's the kind of work that these people did in those days when they built radios. They really built the radio as a work of art, and this is one of the nicest of them. And of course, there were some people who didn't build their radios as a work of art. This is actually a radio transmitter built on a breadboard, very big breadboard, and it actually worked. I went over to the guy's house and we made contact with somebody with this thing. But anyway, I got a big laugh out of that. And I had a lot of friends in New York at that point that built their own stations. Here's W2URE with his radio station, just a beautiful setup. And my favorite of all is this guy in Queens in New York who had built this beautiful transmitter. If you look at him, you can sort of sense that he's almost making love to that transmitter. He loves it. He built that thing from scratch, and he's sort of stroking it. And I realized when I looked at this picture that many of us, when we build radio equipment, we form sort of an emotional bond with our radios. And I thought back to all the radios that I had built, and they sort of become part of you. And so it's a great picture. I just love seeing him there. In any event, some people even went further than that. Here are 2 people who became very involved in the history of Morse code to the point of having permanent tattoos on their arm. It almost looks like the same tattoo artist, or at least the same philosophy of tattoo on each arm. On the left, we have Samuel Morse's tombstone, and Armstrong, who was a radio pioneer, and a picture of a telegraph key. And on the right, we have Alfred Vail, who was the partner of Samuel Morse and some radio people. And they both have flowers, and they're both overlaid on cobwebs. So it's a very strange set of tattoos, but I thought it was quite fascinating. In those days, when you had to do things and you didn't have just the right equipment to do it with, you made do made things work no matter what you had. I bought a farm in Vermont with 11 outbuildings on it, so I could put some of my ham radio junk and equipment up in a place where I could put up lots of antennas. And there was no one up there to help me, so I bought a couple of old Roan tower sections at a hamfest and hooked them up onto my beat up old case extend-a-hoe backhoe and used the backhoe to help me put up the antennas. So you learn to make things work even if you didn't have the right parts. At that point, Radio Row was displaced by the World Trade Center, and I wrote lots of letters about it, and nobody paid any attention. They completely wiped out Radio Row, and eventually they wiped out all of the things that I had come to love about Radio Row. G&G Military Electronics was gone, their catalog, which was just fascinating. There were still a few companies that stayed in business. Heathkit remained in business, and the fair radio sales out in Lima, Ohio, had the most fabulous catalog of surplus equipment. So as long as you weren't in New York City, these radio stores and radio outlets stayed in business. The entire Radio Row area in New York City was pretty much wiped out by building the World Trade Center. And then when the World Trade Center came down, it wiped out virtually all of what was left of Radio Row, the picture after the World Trade Center came down. A lot of bad things were happening in those days. I went for a trip on a fairly large boat, and I talked my way up into the radio room by saying I'm a ham radio operator. They didn't know what that was. And I got up into the radio room. There was not a telegraph key in sight. And I asked the radio operator, "Do you know the Morse code?" He said, "I'm not required to know the Morse code." So this is the radio room on a ship in those days. And that's why I say the history of radio was disappearing fast. All of the communications on this ship were performed by satellites rather than by radio equipment. Heathkit, however, stayed in business. And many of us in ham radio got our start in building things with Heathkits. And I always loved their catalogs. They always had this wonderful cover picture on the catalog. And here's this daddy who has just built a Heathkit, and the two kids are laughing. I don't know quite why. Maybe he made a mistake, and his wife is bringing over some food because anyway, that was Christmas time in Heathkit, and I love that picture. And many of the Heathkit catalog covers were similar to that. Heathkit was an interesting company. I'll just run very quickly through the history of Heathkit. In 1900, Ed Heath founded the Heath Airplane Company. There weren't even any airplanes in those days. His ultimate products in the early days were parts, airplane parts. And in 1926, he had produced the Heath Parasol, which is that little airplane that you see over on the right. And he produced it in kit form. So you could actually buy a Heathkit airplane in those days, and not very good for his business. In 1931, Ed Heath was killed during a test flight in one of his airplanes. So that didn't last for very long, and that was the end of the Heath Company. But his engineer, Howard Anthony, actually came along and bought the Heath Company name at auction and produced aircraft parts and aircraft radios during World War II. So he made a fair amount of business making aircraft parts. So in 1945, when the war ended, Howard Anthony decided to buy a huge load of war surplus electronic parts. And he got parts enough to be able to actually design and offer radio kits using initially just the war surplus parts that he had gotten. In 1946, after the war had ended, he offered test equipment in kit form and used his stash of parts and several thousand 5-inch cathode ray tubes that he bought surplus from the military to produce a kit oscilloscope. And he bought metal fabricating plants and wrote instructions on how to assemble, and finally came out with his first kit product, which was the 01 oscilloscope. So these are pretty rare collectibles nowadays, the 01 oscilloscope, but they really were the first product of the Heath Company. And as we know, Heath went on to make thousands and thousands of others. This is a look inside the Heath Company, the shipping department, and the shipment, the packing of the Heath kits. And this is their customer service room. These guys had to answer phone calls from people who had built Heathkits and couldn't get them to work. And the problem was that Heathkit offered that they would make any Heathkit that you bought work or replace it free. So you could send your Heathkit, no matter how badly you had damaged the thing, they would sit there and try and fix it. And that was the service department. Here are the guys at the service bench trying to fix these radios. And I always laugh when I thought, suppose I had sent them in that night kit radio that I had completely destroyed by wiring all the tube socket pins together. They would probably sit there and drink beer and send another kit to me rather than try and fix it. But always fun to talk to these guys and hear the stories of the amazing messed up kits that they had to deal with. The last Heathkit was a garage parking assistant kit, and then Heathkit pretty much disappeared from the market. Same thing with Radio Shack, except Radio Shack actually grew into a huge conglomerate with Radio Shack stores. This is their first store in Boston, and they eventually had stores even in small towns throughout the country and in Europe. And all of a sudden, they just went down some kind of a misjudgment in their business policy, and they were gone. So too with many collectors of radio equipment. This is a man who collected telegraph keys, and he has passed away. Here's another man showing off his collection of radio equipment. Lots of hams developed radio collections, and when they passed away, the collection simply sat there in the house, and somehow the family had to dispose of it. Here's Bob Merriam, the founder of the Rhode Island Museum of Wireless and Steam, operating a spark transmitter. And here is myself at age 73. 73 is a scary age for a ham, because that's sort of a statement that, hey, goodbye, good luck. 73 means goodbye. And I realized that I had barns full of equipment. I didn't know what to do with them. Sitting here looking at all my wafer switches. I probably had enough wafer switches to build 1,000 radios at that point. And I always had thought, well, you never can have too much wafer switches. Well, I had too many wafer switches. So I decided to go to a relatively local ham fest called Nearfest, New England Amateur Radio Festival, and it's located in Deerfield, New Hampshire. This is the lineup of people coming to buy stuff from you when you sell at Nearfest. And here I am with about 20 tables that I've lined up at Nearfest, and I've put up $1 sign on everything on the table. You could have anything on the entire table for $1. And so the mob came, and at the end of the day, everything was gone except one little antenna insulator on the very end of my table. And that made me feel pretty good. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to do this with my tube collection. I had the whole upstairs of one of my barns was just filled with tubes. And I knew that I could never use 1,000 6SL7s or 6L6s. So I took my backhoe, I ran it up to there, and loaded up the bucket with just boxes and boxes of tubes. And I took all these tubes to the Saratoga Amateur Radio Club Hamfest in Schenectady, New York, and Ballston Spa, New York. And I put all these tubes out, $1 on my table. And at the end of the day, those tables were clear. And I didn't just make that up. People just came along and bought them by the box full. It was an amazing experience. So I decided I just can't keep on doing this. I got to get rid of all this equipment. I've got dozens and dozens of radios in the house. Took my backhoe, loaded the stuff into the bucket, and it was a little sad to do it, but I put all that equipment in the bucket and buried it in a great big huge hole in the ground. And of course, I couldn't do that with my Heathkits because I had really come to love those Heathkits. So I made a little garden for my Heathkits and buried them in the garden. And of course, I'm making this all up for the talk because you know as well as I know that no ham would ever bury his Heathkits in the ground. I took them all to the various hamfests, but I thought it would add a little humor to the talk. In any event, many hams did die over the years and leave huge estates filled with houses filled with ham equipment. This is a picture of the inside of a house of a man in Vermont who passed away fairly recently. And you can see every room was just filled with ham gear. His attic was filled with ham gear. His barn was filled with ham gear. And in the middle, you can see his machine shop. And if you look in back of the furthermost lathe, you'll find a complete Collins transmitter receiver setup tucked in there. And what do you do with something like this? Well, you call K1UR. Try and remember that. That's a really useful name. It is the call letters of Nels Anderson, and his partner Gene will come to a ham's house and literally clean it out for the family. And they will put these equipment on eBay. And their policy is to give the family of the ham 50% of what they sell these stuff for on eBay. And that's a really good deal because they will pick it up. They will put it on eBay. They'll deal with eBay. They will ship it to the customers, collect the money, and then give the money to the estate. So I highly recommend it. K1UR is their eBay name, and you can email them k1ur@arrl.net, Nels. Absolutely a wonderful service for all of us who have too much equipment. And of course, we move on to the future of ham radio. And in fact, Nels is helping with that by helping people to dispose of their equipment and passing that equipment along to new hams. In terms of the future of ham radio, one of the stalwarts is the American Radio Relay League. And at that point, Howard W2JB was a good friend of mine. He was involved in the ARRL. And the ARRL is the only organization we have in ham radio, with some help from CQ magazine, but mainly it's ARRL that is acting as an interface between us as hams and government regulators, which are constantly being besieged by requests for some of our ham radio spectrum. They want to use it for this or that or the other thing, and ARRL steadfastly fights to keep the ham bans. ARRL publishes a magazine called QST, and for a long time, I was annoyed at QST because they did not publish anything about antique radios in there. Their policy was, no, we are at the cutting edge of new radio research, and we're not going to publish anything having to do with antiques. But I find that in the last many years, 5 or 10, maybe 20 years, they've started publishing articles on early ham radio operations and radios. You see on the right, they have in this issue a brief summary of what was in the QST magazine 100 years ago, 50 years ago, and 25 years ago. They have articles under Celebrating Our Legacy that tell how people got into ham radio, sort of like what I told you and showed you that book. and they have articles on classic radio. And the person who really got CQST to get involved with this is a man named John Dilks, K2TQN, and here he is, a wonderful guy, and he actually put together a radio museum in a bus, and he drove that bus around for many, many years. Here he is with his radio museum bus parked out in front of the ARRL headquarters in Connecticut, and some pictures inside the bus. On the upper right, you see that he has a complete, very early radio station that he operates from the bus with its antennas, and a picture of him down below with a much more modern station. So we really owe John a big debt of gratitude for keeping ham radio alive and well in the ham radio magazines, QST, and also we have the Antique Wireless Association Museum, which is a museum that focuses on early radio equipment. And they're quite active, beautiful collection. And now they have actually installed a complete Radio Shack that's operable. And you can go to that Radio Shack and operate radio transmitters that range from the 1920s up to 2020s. So 100 years of different radio equipment in one museum, and in their Radio Shack, it's actually functioning. You can go and operate the equipment. CQ Magazine's another wonderful, wonderful ambassador for ham radio. They have great contests. They have great articles on building, and both CQ and QST have had to raise their prices dramatically. And I have to say that I hope that you will all continue to subscribe, or will subscribe, to these two magazines, because they are really helping us to preserve ham radio and keep it active. Their main focus, both magazines and both organizations, is on the continuance of ham radio. Some of the companies that started out even before ham radio are still in business. The one that is actually the longest lasting company is the Vibroplex company. And this is a picture of the early days of the Vibroplex company. You can see this hand operated machine tools that they used to make their Vibroplex keys. And they made all those keys themselves. And it was a dramatic operation. Here's how the Vibroplex company looks these days. And their main product is that Vibroplex bug, or semi-automatic key that you see in the lower left there. That happens to be the presentation model of the key, but that key is called the Vibroplex Original. They made a few other models, but nowhere near as many as the Vibroplex Original, and they have made just about, well, over 550,000 telegraph keys. That's a huge number of telegraph keys to have made. The administrative assistant in the lower right there, nowadays they have a computer-controlled milling machine and drilling machine that does the key making partly for them. They still do some of this by hand, but the machines speed up the production, and it's still a fairly labor-intensive process. Here are some Vibroplex keyer bases, and they still have people on their staff that assemble the Vibroplex keys in person. You see the assembly, hand-assembled keys on the left and on the right, and they have a huge stockroom filled with key parts. And one of the really nice things about Vibroplex is that you can send them an old Vibroplex key, and they will take it in and they'll evaluate it. You see one of their employees looking at the key in the lower left corner there, and they will make notes on what the key needs, and they will actually repair the key for you if they possibly can. They can't always fix every key, because there's some Vibroplex keys that are extremely, extremely rare, and they don't have any more parts for them, but they'll do their best to bring your key back to functioning, and I give them a great deal of credit for that. They are being challenged a bit by Piero Bigali's company, a wonderful wonderful Italian key maker, a delightful person, very, very enthusiastic about making keys, and his keys are very avant-garde and very interesting. So he's contributing to interest in ham radio, and people just love his keys in the same way that Heil microphones are popular with people. So people who are making these things for hams are helping ham radio to continue. Another place where ham radio is visible to the public, and these people are helping ham radio to be recognized, helping people to come into ham radio, and that is radio displays at World War II radio reenactments or World War II military reenactments. And often when they set up a World War II reenactment, in one of those tents or several tents, there will be radio equipment being operated and demonstrated. Here's another tent with some military radio equipment being operated. And even in Civil War reenactments, we see that people have set up telegraph tents. Telegraph was very, very important during the Civil War, but many people have forgotten that it even existed back then. And strangely enough, if you buy a book on the Civil War, look through the books on the Civil War, you'll find that very few of them even mention telegraph, and even fewer of them even have the word telegraph in their index. So people need to be remembered that telegraphy was important in the Civil War, and that Lincoln actually spent a lot of time in the telegraph office reading dispatches from his generals in the field. And in that way, that history has been disappearing, and people like this reenactor are bringing it back and making sure that people are still aware of it. There's a lot of research going on in the area of ham radio. Even this day, there is an outfit called RM Noise, and they are experimenting with using artificial intelligence to filter out noise. The idea is you can train artificial intelligence software to recognize sinusoidal waves as opposed to irregular noise pulses, and the AI will help pick out the sinusoidal waves of Morse code or even voice in a background of random noise. So a lot of interesting research is going on, and this software can actually be loaded into your computer and you can use it on the air. There are wonderful radio clubs that are still operating, and very enthusiastically. The New England Vintage Electronics Club is one of the many, many local clubs that focuses on keeping people involved in electronics, in early electronics, and celebrating, as they say, electronic devices throughout the ages. NEVAC has great shows and great meets, as do many, many local ham radio clubs. The Long Island CW Club has over 3,600 members, and they do hundreds of Zoom classes each week, lots of on-the-air training and operating on Zoom. And their job, and as they see it, is to keep CW alive, Morse code communications alive and well in ham radio. Rat Pack, which is sort of a strange name for a club, is the Radio Amateur Training and Planning and Activities Club, and they have lots and lots of activity, ham radio related activities. You can look them up on the internet. The Deutsches Amateur Radio Club, that is the German Amateur Radio Club, is the equivalent of our ARRL. And here is a table that they've set up at their big Friedrichshafen, Germany Hamfest, in which kids sit down at the table and learn to solder, hopefully a lot better than I learned to solder, under the tutelage of some of their instructors. And of course, they're individual daddies, like David in the background here, who build large telegraph keys for their kid to play with in hopes that the child will eventually become interested in ham radio. All sorts of hope for the future in this area. My own contribution to this is a build-it-yourself telegraph kit that takes nothing more than a few pieces of wood, a little wire, and a couple of pieces of metal to build a complete working telegraph set. And amazingly, over 7,000 kids have built this set in the 35 years that I've had it on the internet. And along with my internet webpage, I have a little request. If you build one of these, send me a picture of it along with you. And I get these wonderful pictures from kids who have built some version of my instructions and set, and then set up little displays for science fairs. This girl actually is in South Africa, Cape Town, South Africa, and has won a science prize in her school with the telegraph set. So there is hope, and the real hope is with the kids. And we have to, in my estimation, keep kids happy. Nearfest really works at that very hard. The New England Amateur Radio Festival in Deerfield, New Hampshire, it's held twice a year. And here's a picture of one of their meetings in which they are demonstrating electronic equipment for some of their kids and members. You'll see all the kids in the foreground there. And part of what they do is help kids to get ham radio licenses and really keep ham radio alive and well. The Nearfest Hamfest has wonderful people ready to talk about ham radio, trying to sell things like microphones. And here's George Rancor, who is an expert on the R390 receivers, showing people how to repair these. Delightful speaker and the wonderful talks that he gives. Another member of the Nearfest crowd collecting some horn antennas. And finally, I'm going to end up with the daughter of the man who really resuscitated and brought back Nearfest, who has just learned to tune a receiver. And it says, let me see, first peak the exciter, then dip the final. And she got her license and looks just as happy with that receiver. Right back to my early days in radio. That receiver must have been about like the radio that I used to talk to as a kid. So that's my story on hope for the future and ham radio. Hope you've enjoyed it. And please feel free to email me. My websites are w1tp.com. And I also have an Enigma Museum at enigmamuseum.com. And yay for ham radio. Let's keep ham radio alive.